Welcome to Theology Curator, a podcast hosted by Kurt Willems and available online at theologycurator.com. Each episode looks at a theological, formational, or cultural theme. We might dig into the life and letters of a radical Jewish teacher named Paul, converse about a pressing contemporary issue, reflect on the nature of following Jesus today, or even attempt to remedy doom and gloom preaching with a good old-fashioned dose of hope. This show is an invitation to build bridges between the first century world of the earliest Christ followers into the 21st century reality we now inhabit. The Jesus we excavate from the rubble of tradition might just surprise us all.
Welcome to Theology Curator. My name is Kurt Willems. I'm your host, and I'm excited to jump in. And to be really honest, it's been way too long since, well, I've been in the groove. The groove for me, honestly, is when it's fall, when my kids are doing the school thing. My wife is a teacher, and she's doing the school thing as a teacher, and I can step into my office and just be present. It's really a gift. Just like leisure, just like the summer. Summer is such a gift. But here we are. It's autumn, as fancy people might say, and we are jumping in. If you didn't listen to the previous episode, you may be wondering, why in the world is he calling this Theology Curator? Well, a couple of quick notes. Number one, for the duration of this podcast, every episode has been called the Paulcast, a podcast all about the Apostle Paul. And that season of my life was awesome. And even today, we're going to be looking at something from Paul. So I don't want you to have the idea that there's no continuity. But what I've done is I've essentially made this podcast broader. And if you happen to be on my email list, you know what I mean by broader, right? So I talk about Paul stuff and biblical studies, of course, but I don't just stick there. I tend to talk about other theological ideas and reflections, ethics, cultural stuff, more pastoral, spiritual formation stuff. So all of these things are really exciting to me. And so the idea came to me, and I tested it on Patreon supporters. I tested it on friends. And a lot of people said, yeah, we like this because we like the kind of content you bring about Paul in podcast form, but we'd love to have some of the stuff you do in writing also in the spoken word, so to speak. And so that's what this journey has been about. And today, my friends, we are jumping into kind of a one-hit wonder, so to speak. I want to talk about Philippians. And in particular, I want to talk about Philippians chapter 4. And I want to catch you up on something. So we went on vacation as a family. Well, we actually got to go to two places. We live in Seattle, Washington, and we did a road trip all the way to Northern California, which is quite a trek. It's about an 8-9 hour drive if you don't have kids. And if you have kids, you break it up in the Eugene area. So that's kind of what we did. We drove to Eugene, and from Eugene went down to see my family who live in a place called Crescent City. Well, that was awesome. We got our In-N-Out fix, and road trip was fun. Our dogs were both with us, and it was just awesome. Came home, had a few weeks at home, good kind of family time and leisure and all the good stuff that summer often brings. And then we had to say goodbye to our pups and head to California again, which was such a gift. And this time, I don't know if you've been to California, but it's so big that it feels like a little country. And so we could easily drive to Northern California, gave you kind of the parameters of that, but to drive to where we're actually from, which is Central California, would have taken a lot longer. And so we fly there every time that we're able. And we had a wonderful time being with friends and family and soaking up just very unique experiences to our childhood. It was beautiful to get to share that with our daughter, Lydia, who's now 6. And she really got to see this aspect of mommy and daddy's life that she can kind of start to understand its significance. And it was awesome. We came back from that trip that was like a 9-day trip, I think, maybe 8. And we already had known that our dog, Sadie, was a little under the weather. She had gone in early in the summer to the vet, and she'd had a reverse sneezing issue. And we figured, oh, this is from like allergies, and we have a really great vet. And so that was her sort of idea, is this is probably allergies, or maybe she inhaled something. And so she had that before our first trip to California. Reverse sneezing looks really bad, but usually isn't terrible, but was definitely dealing with congestion and stuff like that. We went on our trip, and she had basically, that whole issue had resolved, and she had a great time. And we didn't really notice any major like red flags or symptoms. We were home for the next few weeks, and then we started noticing a little bit of a wheeze, but she has a history of this. So it's not uncommon for her to get a little wheezy. And so we kind of said, you know what? We're going to keep monitoring her, and hopefully she shakes it just like she shook the sneezing. And we'll kind of ask our house sitter to give us updates. And she did phenomenal. She sent me updates and let me know. And everything was kind of like iffy. We weren't really sure. And so towards the end of our time in California, I actually called my vet, had an appointment set up for the Monday we got back. And of course, we arrived home on a Saturday night, almost midnight, and our dogs are there, and they're excited and they're overjoyed. I mean, it was so awesome. We love them, as you can imagine. And by the way, Sadie, out of Sadie and Miley, Sadie is like my first pet. And so just adore and have this connection that's hard to explain, especially if you're not an animal person. I was not an animal person. This dog was almost, and I say this jokingly, but kind of forced into my life after the first year of marriage. Lauren really wanted a puppy, found an awesome, cute puppy at a shelter that we were able to rescue. And, she became part of our lives instantly. I mean, she was our family. A year later, we got another dog named Miley, who I just also adore for a ton of other reasons, actually. And she's been in our life ever since. So 11 years and 10 years. Well, if you've been following social media, you know that Sadie didn't make it this last month. Short version of the story is we get home, and of course, she is excited and jumping around. I mean, she seems normal, and then it's like she can't stop. It's almost like she had been holding on until she saw us. And when she saw us, she just kind of released what her body was experiencing. And in that release, a bunch of coughing really started. And it was clear that she was struggling to get enough air. And so at that point, I was just like, oh my gosh, here we are, just getting back from vacation. I already have a vet appointment set up. Hopefully it's just a cold or another allergy issue, since that's what we've been tracking. And here she is, and she is just struggling. And so we debated, is she really struggling? Is she not? And finally I said that, I think she's really struggling. And Lauren was like, yeah, she is. And so we took Sadie to the vet. We took her to the emergency hospital vet, and they were amazing. The doctor there was amazing. The doctor shed some tears with me, and here I am at 1:30 in the morning, not knowing what I'm going to do. Of course, if you've ever had to go through this, the financial bit is intense. And we figured out a way with, honestly, some care credit debt. I mean, that's the reality of how we do this. And I should add that a bunch of friends on Facebook, out of the blue, were just like, hey, is there a way to contribute to Sadie's bills as you fight for her life? And I was like, oh man, it just blew me away. And so we actually had, $400 or $500 that was donated, which really made a big dent. But you can imagine it was a little bit more than that. But we decided, you know what, we want to give this member of our family, this pup, one shot. We've got to give her a shot. So she stayed there for a little over a day and was able to come home on oxygen and was doing progressively well. And then we'd have a setback, and a setback. And then on Sunday, so about a week after she went in, it was clear that something had turned, and we knew she wasn't going to make it. And we had to take her to the hospital, and we had to say goodbye. And even as I'm recalling this, I mean, I don't know if you can hear it in my voice, but my eyes are welled up because that was harder than I ever could have thought. And yet, sitting with her over that week, sharing stories about how she had changed my life, how she had really opened me up to loving animals, how she had opened me up to loving humans better, how she had, I mean, my empathy radar just went up so much that I was a vegetarian for 6 years, highly because I saw her and I saw animals. And there's a variety of reasons why I'm not anymore, but you can tell like her influence and impact was powerful, both emotionally and spiritually, I'd say. And so we had a lot of opportunities to just be with her and get some kisses. She felt good enough to do some things around the house, and then we said goodbye. And as I've been thinking about that and what I was learning through that, as I wept, I mean, I cannot even express how the pain hit me and caused crying and caused sadness. But what I was able to glean in all of that is something that has really been a challenge for me, especially with Sadie, but now in life in general. Let me explain. So when Sadie was younger, we knew that she already had issues. She had heart issues. She had a lung issue. She had a liver issue. I mean, she's had issues to our knowledge, for over 8 years. And during that season, I was already worrying about this moment, her dying, her not making it. And I spent those years full of joy and excitement and just in love with this pup and my other pup, of course, and my family. I don't want you to think I'm like more animal than human, but you get the idea. Like I really gave what I could when I could in a lot of ways. But at the same time, that sort of discontentment, that sort of anticipating the worst case scenario, that lack of peace that was in the back of my mind, always sort of kind of kept me in this odd tension of, it's called pre-grieving, I think is what I've heard. And so I was kind of pre-grieving, and in pre-grieving, which is natural and understandable, I don't judge myself for that. But what I found is that my ability to be content and present in the moment often was challenged by those feelings, by those experiences. There's so much more I could say, but the bottom line for me in this episode is to share with you that what I've come to learn and am still learning through this process is that love is worth pain. Love is worth pain. And what I'm doing as I think about the passage in Philippians chapter 4 is I'm doing this exercise where I'm trying to imagine a life of contentment that accepts the reality that pain is real, that accepts the reality that joy can be present amidst pain, and that there is a peace in that tension that is so irrational and so counterintuitive that it could only come from God. It can only be generated from a good and loving creator. And I think that good and loving creator has revealed himself as Jesus. And so Paul in Philippians chapter 4 gets this. And so I'm going to read the passage. I want to make just like 3 big observations. And I'm not going to spend too long this podcast episode, but I did want to just process that out loud. And if anything, if no one listens to this episode, or if this is not your thing, like, oh man, he's getting all touchy-feely in this one, or, if anything like that, that's okay. You know what? I'm going to be really honest with you. This is, in a heavy way, recording this and articulating this is about me today in some sense. I hope it's helpful for you. I hope it's helpful for listeners. But in a real sense, I'm just sort of processing what I've experienced in the month of August forward. And hopefully it's helpful for you. And if it's not, we'll have some interviews coming up and we'll have some other stuff coming up that hopefully will spark your interest. But I just really wanted to do this. So is that cool? Okay, so let's go for it. So a couple of thoughts. First of all, here's a little bit of helpful background, right? So if you were looking at a map right now, which you do not have unless you are uber fast at finding things on cell phone, but if you're looking at a map of the Mediterranean, what you'd see is to the, I'm going to say, at least my map, the bottom right corner on my map has Palestine, the region where Israel and Jerusalem and all of this has historically been. And if you go up and kind of curve around the Mediterranean as it curves to our left, look at me using left and right instead of north and south. Hopefully you get the idea. You follow the coastline a little bit and you end up in Philippi. And by a little bit, I mean, it's a very significant trek. I mean, you're passing Asia Minor, and you're passing places like Ephesus, Sardis, Pergamum, all the Revelation stuff. And eventually you get to the north there, and it's Philippi. And from Philippi, if you were to go even further to the left on the map, you would go left, and then you'd go up to the north, and you go into Italy. And of course, in Italy is Rome. And so we do not know exactly where Paul is in prison, but we think that it's likely in Rome, and if not Rome, possibly Ephesus. For years, it was Ephesus. A lot of people now think it's Rome, maybe towards the latter part of his ministry, and he's writing this letter, and the themes that come out over and over again there's so many, but are these ideas of rejoice, find gladness, in all things, like in all kind of situations and all kind of circumstances. And the way you do that is to look at Jesus. And so by the time you get to chapter 2, of course, there's that Christ hymn, that very famous hymn, where we see that the God of all creation becomes the incarnate Jesus. And Jesus doesn't cling to his rights as divinity, and kind of, we have this fancy word, kenosis, kind of releases that. And what does he do? He empties himself and takes on the form of a human being, which is compared to being like a servant or a slave, because compared to being God and human, of course, that is a massive contrast. So Paul uses language of what kind of contrast we might imagine. It's a big contrast. And even there, he says, look, God looks like Jesus, and Jesus is humble. Jesus is willing to endure. And yet, in his humiliation, in his marginalization, he is being vindicated as the one who all of creation will one day bow to in heaven and in earth and under the earth, right? So these themes come up over and over again. Of course, his previous life in Judaism, that's another hot button issue. He's a Hebrew of Hebrews. He's a Pharisee, all of this. And my view has been that he's not saying he's no longer a Pharisee, but he is a Pharisee who has taken on the yoke of Jesus, and he redefines his Pharisaism within the context of Messiah Jesus, and thus he is a Pharisee who follows Jesus by the power of the Holy Spirit, who is on a mission to the Gentiles, to the nations, as we've talked about in other episodes. And here, at the end of the letter, Paul's going to try to accomplish a lot of things, but the part we're going to look at is, what do we do in the midst of unpeace and peace? And we're talking about a lot of internals here, I think, but there's externals that contribute. And so in chapter 4, verse 4, check this out. This is what he says. I'm going to read from the Common English Bible and kind of go from there. In verse 4, he says, "Be glad in the Lord always. Again, I say, be glad. Let your gentleness show in your treatment of all people. The Lord is near. Don't be anxious about anything. Rather, bring up all your requests to God in your prayers and petitions, along with giving thanks. Then the peace of God that exceeds all understanding will keep your hearts and minds safe in Christ Jesus." A couple of quick thoughts and then a big thought. So quick thought here is, number one is, I don't think what Paul is saying is when you have anxiety, pray it away. I just don't buy that. I mean, if you look at the totality of his letters and you look at the life of Jesus, anxiety isn't something that you simply pray away. Now, there may be times in your life when you are going through something and this anxiety that you don't know where it came from creeps in, and you just need a moment of peace and you need God to just be gracious. And you might pray, God, take away this anxiety or help me deal with this. Of course, I think that can be helpful. But maybe one thought to consider, and I won't go off on this too long, is that praying away anxiety is one approach. And Jesus even tried to do some of that in the Garden of Gethsemane, take this cup from me. But he also said, look, I will bear the cup. I will endure the anxieties that are about to increase in me, both physically and emotionally, for the greater good. And even in Hebrews, if we're going to jump around a lot, right, it says Jesus had joy knowing that the outcome of the cross, right? The joy set before him, he endures the cross because he knows that his mission is so central to the way that the world is going to be healed and reconciled and redeemed. And so keeping all of that in mind, one thought might be, and this is the big idea, is that there's a peace that is irrational. I mean, it is irrational. The kind of peace that Paul is claiming to have found is irrational to a lot of people, to a lot of us. Because in finding this peace, he has said, look, you don't have to be anxious about anything, but there is a peace that transcends understanding. There's a peace that your brain can't even think up on its own. And the way that you find that safe, beautiful peace is by stepping into dynamic give relationship with Jesus the Messiah. And so Paul believes and has experienced like so much hardship, so much pain, so much suffering. As he writes this from jail, he knows that something bigger than himself, someone more powerful than he, more gracious than he, more peaceful than he, can in fact bring peace in the midst of anxiety. Not that anxiety goes away, but rather that when anxiety is real, peace can coexist there. And it is irrational and it is good. And so if we continue the passage here, as we just do a quick tour, verse 8 goes on and says, from now on, brothers and sisters, if anything is excellent and if anything is admirable, focus your thoughts on these things. All that is true, all that is holy, all that is just, all that is pure, all that is lovely, and all that is worthy of praise. Practice these things, whatever you've learned, received, heard, or saw in us. The God of peace will be with you. If I were to pause there at verse 9, after verse 9, this is just profound, that something is accessed in our imagination. A lot of times people talk about the imagination as if it's like childish and unhelpful and ridiculous. But what a lot of people have come to realize, both in neuroscience and psychology and in the spiritual tradition, is that in the imagination, we can brew thoughts, we can experience good things that change our brains. We literally can we can rewire our brains as we think about good things. The inverse is also possible. As we think about negative things, we are wiring our brains for negativity and depression. So what Paul is doing 2,000 years before any of the cool studies and hipster books have come out about how positive thinking can enhance your life. And I'm not saying name it and claim it. I'm just saying that saturating yourself in all that is good and sitting in that imaginative space in contemplation and perhaps prayer with Jesus, like doing that is something to practice, Paul says. And he says, this is a source of peace. He basically is saying that peace is accessed in the imagination. Another big idea there, right? That peace is accessed in the imagination. Some of us need, more than we recognize, to step into our imaginative capacities with beautiful, holy, and good, gracious thinking with God in the quiet. And if we can step into that, our patterns of anxiety and stress and struggle, they may not ever go away. But for Paul, there is a peace that enters the story through the imagination, dwelling on the kinds of thoughts that come from Jesus, dwelling on the good in our lives. Maybe for you, it's just the practice of gratitude. Something that has been revolutionary for me is the practice of gratitude. Many mornings I wake up and I have a routine and I work on just self-care and this sort of thing. And one of the practices that has been so just humanizing and helped me so much is thanking Jesus for the things that I'm grateful for in the morning. Sometimes it's my kids, my wife, my dogs, my friends, my extended family, my church, my whatever. There's so many things that when we start to look and feel, we can actually say, oh man, I have a lot. I have something here to be grateful for. So what we've said is there's a peace that is irrational. Peace is accessed through the imagination. And to finish out this passage and come to another point or two and wrap up our time, let's jump into it's still chapter 4 of Philippians, but we're in verse 10, where Paul continues and says, I was very glad in the Lord because now at last you have shown concern for me again. Of course, you were always concerned, but had no way to show it. I'm not saying this because I need anything, for I have learned how to be content in any circumstance. I'm going to pause there and simply just highlight that one of the things that Paul appreciates about this community in Philippi is that they provided financial resources for him, probably specifically when he was in jail, as he's in jail, to make sure that he has what he needs to eat and drink, and he's taken care of as he awaits his trial or finishes out his sentencing, depending on your theory there. And so this is his thought, though, is it's so great. You have been gracious to me and have sent your concern to me through financial giving. But here's what I've learned. I've learned how to be content in any circumstance. And he goes on in verse 12, he says, I know the experience of being in need and of having more than enough. I have learned the secret to being content in any and every circumstance, whether full or hungry, or whether having plenty or being poor. I can endure all these things through the power of the one who gives me strength. Or as maybe you memorized, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. This is powerful stuff. I mean, another big idea is that the secret of contentment is learned through pain. The secret of contentment. He says, look, I've learned the secret of being content no matter the circumstance. And how has that looked for Paul? It's looked like I have times when life is painful and hurtful and hard, and I have times when I have enough. And it is both of those experiences. But I would venture to guess, particularly the experience of pain, that allows him to say with confidence at the end of this little passage we're looking at, that he can endure all of that because of the power of Jesus who gives him strength. As I look back at my month or so, and I think about my dog, and I think about just the pain that I was holding in all of that, what I can tell you is that the pain was real. And it wasn't just for my dog. It was for other pains that maybe I hadn't allowed myself as an Enneagram 7, if you know what that means. If you don't worry, but hadn't allowed myself to feel the gravity of other pains in my story. And it's almost like some of that pain was entering into this storyline with my precious dog, Sadie. And as I sat there with my pain, the temptation is to say things like, dogs only live between 8 and 18 years. Maybe I should never have done this. Maybe it's not worth it. Maybe it's not what I need. And what I've come to realize, not just through this experience, but it's illustrative of a longer story that's not going to be shared in this podcast, that it is the risk of love is the risk of pain. And that love is worth it, as I've said earlier. That love is worth it. And in fact, contentment is what happens when you are present to what is real. And what is real is that pain isn't going anywhere. But neither is the possibility of joy. Neither is a possibility of your opportunity to, with Paul, say, rejoice in the Lord always. Be glad in the Lord always. The secret of contentment is learned through pain. And I'm saying that out loud, and I'm going to just simply say this, that it is what I am learning, and I hope that something today has resonated with you. I hope that something today is inviting you to move towards peace along with the anxieties of life, along with the pain, along with the frustration. And what would it look like for you to sit in that imaginative space with God and sit there and simply say, I don't know what to do here, but I want my imagination, I want my thought life, I want my inward person to be saturated by all of these things Paul is talking about, all that is good and holy and pure and just. I want to be saturated by the love of God. I want to be known by Jesus. Imagine inward peace and contentment alongside the inevitable pain and frustration. Those things, for so much of my life, I thought I would escape my childhood eventually, and the pain and frustration and the hard stuff would finally be resolved, and I'd have this life of bliss. Or I'd get done with this job, or I'd get done with this thing, or I'd get done with this project that's been so hard, so frustrating, and then the next thing, or the next place, or the next opportunity, that would be inward peace. And for Paul, writing from a prison cell, he says, anxiety is with you. Invite God into the storyline. Think about the beautiful things. Think about the good things. And notice with me if peace that transcends any kind of understanding, irrational peace, can actually transform you. Friends, I hope this has been encouraging in some way. I hope you've enjoyed diving into Paul through a more pastoral lens than we have, at least recently. And ultimately, I hope that wherever you are on the journey, that you are finding ways to connect with others on that journey as well, who are seeking to find Jesus, who are seeking to know God, who are seeking a life of contentment, a life of presence, and a life of joy. That, irrational as it may seem, is the life that God wants for each one of us. There's more episodes coming, some great interviews that may even surprise you that are being set up as we speak. Expect some interviews, expect some more content on Romans. I do want to return to Romans. We've been there last time I was doing consistent episodes, and I want to come back to those themes. And friends, expect a space where biblical studies, church, and spiritual formation, along with cultural things, all come together in one podcast. Hopefully it's helpful. Hopefully at the end of it all, you can say that this podcast has helped you follow Jesus and engage others in intelligent and humanizing ways.
Thanks for listening to Theology Curator. For more resources from Kurt Willems, check out theologycurator.com/newsletter to sign up for our email update list. For new listeners of the podcast, we hope you will subscribe via iTunes, Google, or your podcast manager of choice. If you like what you hear, please leave the show a review. For regular listeners, consider supporting Kurt's online ministry at patreon.com/Kurt Willems. Lastly, please don't let this conversation end when the episode is over. We hope you feel empowered in regular life to explore theology and faith in intelligent and humanizing ways.